Well, thank you everyone for joining us this morning or this evening if you've joined us from the United States. My name is Michael Buckland. I'm the CEO of the McKell Institute here in Australia, and we're very excited to be teaming up with the Progressive Policy Institute in the United States to talk about some of the most pressing issues in public policy. Whether in the United States or Australia or anywhere in between, the growth of technology companies, the global reach of this innovation has been one of the biggest public policy opportunities and challenges in recent times. And so one of the things that's been happening, certainly within the Australian context, has been a response that's often well behind the pace of the technology. That is a policy response well behind the pace of technology. And so here we are trying to keep up. And so we are joined by two fantastic representatives, which I'll go into introduce shortly, as well as a panel of experts from industry. But before we get started with the formal introductions, I would like to introduce Alex Stapp from the Progressive Policy Institute. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. I'm the Director of Technology Policy here at the Progressive Policy Institute. PPI is a moderate center-left think tank based in Washington, D.C., and we're excited to host both our keynote panelists and our policy panelists today, and to co-host with the McKell Institute. When I was thinking about the themes for today's event, my mind kept going towards that traditional Chinese curse, "May you live in interesting times." I think we definitely live in interesting times right now. We live in an era of rapid technological change that is knitting the world ever closer together. That means global communication, global commerce. The benefits of that are immense for connecting people with good intentions together. But at the same time, those same systems connect bad actors to each other and to the world. We're currently seeing, a rising tide of misinformation, conspiracy theories, hate speech, foreign interference in our elections, and even privacy violations. And policymakers, both in Washington, D.C., and Australia, and around the world, need to come up with solutions to mitigate these very real and tangible harms. But the problem facing policymakers around the world is, how do you mitigate those harms while still respecting freedom of speech and maintaining access to these platforms that users around the world benefit from? And I hope a lot of the conversation today will shed light on those interesting trade-offs and those interesting tensions. And the last thing I'll say is that, I think the spirit of today's event is about partnership between the United States and Australia. I believe that liberal democracies should be the ones crafting the international rules of the road for technology and the internet. And I hope to see that happen, because if we don't, authoritarian regimes like China will do it for us. And so I hope today's event is one step in the right direction on that path. And I'll hand it back to Michael from the McKell Institute to do our introductions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are joined today by the Federal Member for Chifley and current Shadow Minister for Industry and Innovation, the Honourable Ed Husic MP. Thank you for joining us, Ed. He has shown a great interest in domestic manufacturing capacity, delivering jobs in Australia, and maximising opportunities from innovation. He's had a long interest in this space, and has been very vocal about the need for Australia to think more proactively about the impact of technology on jobs and communities and industry itself. And so we are also joined by Congressman Joe Courtney, who is still subject to perhaps having to run off for a vote. So we'll give everyone a little bit of a warning there in case it comes up. Congressman Joe Courtney was elected in 2006 to represent the 2nd Congressional District of Connecticut in the House of Representatives. He serves on the House Armed Services Committee and House Education and Labor Committee. He has been heavily involved in bipartisan measures such as the Congressional Shipbuilding Caucus, and we welcome him here today to share the two perspectives from two countries with similar values but long distances. And so I might start by throwing to Congressman Joe Courtney. Welcome today, and thank you for joining us.
Great. Well, thank you, Michael and Alex, for organizing this event. And it's nice to meet my colleague, Ed Husic, from far away. One other sort of tidbit I would share about my work in Congress is I actually co-chair the Friends of Australia Caucus, which is a bipartisan group of about 60 House members, and there's a decent sprinkling of bipartisan members in the Senate, which is actually a fairly active caucus. The embassy in Washington, I think has recognized that we're a co-equal branch of government, and that foreign policy, economic policy, trade policy, national security policy originates on Capitol Hill, even though there's many that are skeptical of that. I mean, the fact is the embassy is right. And I've had the opportunity to visit a few times on the leadership dialogue meetings between members of parliament and Congress. It is extremely beneficial. We learn a lot from each other, I think. And frankly, I think right now we're at a moment where actually I think the US learns a lot more from Australia than the reverse. Just really quickly, just a couple of days ago, we had a sort of a press event and announcement of legislation about ways to protect local journalism in the US, where again, the large tech platforms, Google, Facebook, have really sapped really the business model for for newspapers and local media outlets that really do the grunt work in terms of generating content. And it's a very tricky issue. I tip my hat to Ed and his colleagues for the law they passed back in February. That it may still be a work in progress for you guys as well, but frankly, it showed that we're not just helpless as democracies in terms of watching the free press sort of evaporate because of really the impact of high-tech platforms. So again, I think this topic is just so incredibly important. I'm sitting in my office in the Rayburn building, which is where I was on January 6th when the insurrection was happening. As some of you may know, we had a pretty gut-wrenching hearing today where four of the Capitol Police and Washington, D.C. police testified about their personal experience about what happened that day. It was, again, reliving, their physical injuries and trauma that they experienced. And, one thing that I think was so very vivid today, which is connected to, I think, today's topic, is the description of, these officers, many of them who had military records, obviously distinguished careers in law enforcement, considered them, sort of proud wearers of the blue. To have people in the riot mob there who basically, had very similar sort of histories in terms of their own military service. There were cops that were, leading the charge to try and, break into the building and stop the certification. And for them to be sort of being accused of being traitors to, police and, the traditional values of this country, in some ways was almost the most traumatic testimony that they testified. And when you think about, well, where is that coming from? How is that happening? I mean, it really is all of the sort of, negative downside to what Alec was describing in terms of the proliferation of misinformation and the, just complete breakdown of any sort of common baseline of civilized society and how a democracy is going to function. And that really is a very tough problem for us to have to grapple with. I'll end by just saying, look, when I've been around back in the Stone Age when campaigns were run pre-digital, and there's no question that in our world there's great benefits to being able to communicate directly with our constituents, and for the democracy there's pluses in terms of being able to run campaigns, insurgent campaigns as challengers, which is healthy in a democracy, and not be sort of wedded to old models that cost so much money and kind of connect you to the vice of campaign fundraising. And so there is no question there's benefits to the democracy, but as we heard today at the hearing on the January 6th, before the January 6th commission, the forces of misinformation, the rise, I would say, of right-wing populism that is driven a lot by, stuff that's on the internet, and it's not, just sort of, people who are weak-minded or, kind of doing it unintentionally. I mean, a lot of this stuff, is very intentional and very purposeful, and it just it's hard to see how the democracy really can kind of keep it together, with that kind of centrifugal force that seems to get accelerated by the rise of the digital world that we live in right now. So I don't have any great answers besides the fact that we're going to try and follow Australia's example in terms of the Protect Journalism Act, which has been introduced in the House and the Senate. Amy Klobuchar is the lead sponsor in the Senate. David Cicilline, my colleague from Rhode Island, is the lead sponsor in the House. I'm a co-sponsor with David. And again, at the event that we were sort of trying to explain to people that this is not pie in the sky, look at Australia. I mean, you should feel good about the fact that people really, were pretty impressed by the fact that, you didn't get totally rolled over by the big tech platforms in terms of the political, counter efforts that they were opposing to that legislation. So anyway, I will stop there. Thank you so much for the invitation. Hope, again, once we can get back to international travel, we can continue these conversations in person. And as they say in the House, I yield the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman. And to everyone watching at home, we will have an opportunity once we hear from the Honourable Ed Husic to ask a couple questions as well. And I think what you've said, Congressman, is evidence that we're grappling with the same policy issues. And hopefully once we can move beyond the responding to these negative, we can also chart a positive path forward to take advantage of these. And with that, I might throw over to the Honourable Ed Husic, Shadow Minister for Innovation. And thank you very much for joining us here today, Ed.
Thank you, Michael, the McKell Institute, PPI, and particularly our friend from across the Pacific in Joe Courtney. Congressman, I understand you may have to run away to participate in a vote. And as we were talking before the proceedings began, I feel your pain, having had to do the same sort of thing in the middle of media interviews as well as webinars. And so please go forth and do your democratic duty, knowing that we understand the position that you're in. I want to first acknowledge that I'm participating in this webinar from Darragland in Western Sydney in Australia, and want to pay my respects to elders past and present, thank them for their custodianship, and also thank the ongoing custodianship that will occur with the emergence of future elders as well. This is it's a tricky topic that we're talking about here, because in many respects we're reflecting this sort of swing in the pendulum that's occurred between the euphoric view about what technology would do for societies, particularly viewed through the prism of the internet, and especially through the course of the late 90s and the first decade of the 2000s. We realized the promise, the ability to bring the world closer together, to do things that we couldn't do previously, and the technology, and especially through the internet initially, would help deliver that. And now at this point in 2021, we're confronted with some of the trickier impacts of that technology, and the type of distrust that is being used as a weapon, either on social media, what's been reflected upon by Congressman Courtney, and in the opening remarks by Michael, through to the use of cyber warfare, or in terms of the issues that arise with lax cyber security. We've gone through that, and nothing better epitomizes, I think, the nature of that swing than a webinar that is being done that is bringing people together from different countries and different parts within our own country on a platform that we wouldn't have expected would allow us to do that a few years ago, and to talk about the impact of technology and its downside. So both the upside and the downside being considered here today, but is being forced on us in part by the nature of the technology and its evolution, and also events like, for example, the changing nature of geopolitics, plus obviously something that has traumatized the world in the form of a global pandemic that has required us to think differently about the way we do things, and also to reimagine how we will do things into the future. It's an active element of conversation, obviously in the US, with the Biden administration wanting to build back better as one of its core focuses in terms of economic and social policy. And certainly here, us trying to reimagine the way that our economy will operate. And in terms of the contribution I just wanted to make today, it was on three grounds. One is the immediate priorities that we have, particularly as those were brought on by the pandemic, the longer term one from an Australian perspective, and also I think Michael and Alec urged us to think about international cooperation. And I think there are a lot of things that we can work on, and Joe touched on some of that with respect to the impact of platform economics as it comes to and the operation of platforms in the way that it intersects with society, and particularly in terms of political discourse, and then wrap things up there. In our own situation, the way in which we are thinking about rebuilding sovereign capability, again, something that's being considered in the US context, we had that brought upon us when we realized our heavy dependence on global supply chains really wasn't sustainable, given a whole range of things, again, geopolitical, but importantly too, in the middle of a pandemic or at the start of it last year, when we expected to be able to have things at the ready, products at the ready, and we realized we didn't have the local manufacturing capability to do so, that we had been in part victims of success, that globalization, which had meant that products could be produced a lot cheaper from offshore and imported, and we would change the way that our economies would operate. People had championed that in times past, but then realized now in the context of a pandemic, when we couldn't get things done, that we had to bring some balance back into this. And I think that is something that we are thinking quite a lot about in the Australian context, particularly looking at with respect to some of our more dominant industry sectors, mining, agriculture, for example, and what we do with ag tech, mining, application of technology in mining, but importantly, naturally, med tech, what we do in medicine, defense, energy technology, the space industry, critical minerals, as I said, food and beverage manufacturing, all these things requiring us to think very deeply about what we do with respect to that. The use of government levers to encourage this, either in terms of spurring on greater R&D, thinking through problems, applying solutions, using, for example, the power of government levers, notably through procurement, that I know Joe Courtney's got a big interest in his side of the fence, because he knows on his side of the Pacific, given that particularly defence procurement means a lot in terms of local economies and jobs, and we're thinking of that quite a lot here. Longer term, in the Australian context, thinking through economic complexity, our economy itself, if you look at it, is largely dependent on those two big players of mining and agriculture. But where is the role, for example, of emerging sectors, and particularly tech? We do have a number of local tech players that are seeing international success. For example, Afterpay is represented here today, and I know that there are a number of others that will be present as well that are making a mark internationally. But what do we do in terms of seeing emerging tech players and also applying what they can do broader within the economy is really important. The way in which R&D can spur that on, Australian spending on R&D has sunk to just under 1.8% of our gross domestic product. It's well below the OECD average. It's far below some world leaders, for example, like South Korea and Israel. And if we are going to be we've got a lot of talent, we've got a lot of human capital talent, but the conversion of that as well into actual application is an issue. And we keep being frustrated by our slide down the Global Innovation Index, and that's got to be dealt with as well. The other challenges too, in terms of automation, The upsides being that technology and its application avoids people being stuck in jobs that are dangerous or dirty or dull, and frees them up to do different type of things. But then the other side of it, the impact of that on wage stagnation, underemployment, the nature of jobs in communities is something that we do need to think and have a much more active discussion in the Australian context. And the other element too being with respect to digital division, because we make an assumption that a lot of people are familiar with technology and can use it and embrace it very well. And that is not necessarily the case. You can see that across a range of age groups and a range of income groups. And that is something that if we are serious about ensuring that technology and its application is beneficial, and that we're not having people with low skills being taken advantage of, that is going to be a longer term challenge as well. And there's a persistent challenge in the Australian context when it comes to tech of not just human capital, that is, we have these massive and chronic skill shortages in tech, longer term that might impede our ability to grow our local tech sector, or ensure that businesses are able to operate in a modern, efficient, effective way. There's also capital shortages as well, because money does drive a lot of the investment in particularly new ideas longer term. And on the international side, finally, we do need to find ways to cooperate. The things that Joe highlighted on a regulatory perspective are really important, and being able to deal with the impact of platforms and their rise. It's totally, in many respects, understandable the way that platforms have risen, the fastest way to bring buyers and sellers together, users and offerers of product as well. But there are distortions that only governments are going to deal with. I don't think self-regulation is going to cut it, and governments need to be up to date with the technology and have an up-to-date regulatory framework on it. Taxation is another issue as well, and global taxation to deal with the way in which the commercial arrangements of platforms have meant that that has eroded the revenue base of countries. And if we want to see the benefit of technology, we want to see the uptake of skills, the investment in R&D, governments need the firepower to do that comes from revenue. But if it's being worn away as a result of some fairly sophisticated taxation arrangements, that's a problem longer term as well, and that needs to be dealt with. And the concentration of market power that comes as a result of that is another regulatory challenge that governments need to work with too. And finally, new technology as well. And I'm trying to sort of go through this relatively quickly, Michael, for you and the audience. Digital infrastructure is really important. The rollout of 5G holds a lot of promise to improve the way the industry works. In particular, it's probably at the forefront of mobile broadband technology with an industry bent to it to change the way that the application of AI, robotics, edge computing, and we do need to get on top of it. The issue is in terms of the sourcing of equipment and the manufacturing of equipment, and the fact that we've had limited manufacturing opportunity. I do think that there are a number of countries in our region, if you swing down from Japan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the US, teaming up in terms of building manufacturing capability, advanced manufacturing capability, and thinking through what we need, not just for current rollouts, but the rollout of 6G that is expected in the next 10 years. And we do need to team up and work with existing players to make sure that the technology is available, and that people have a variety of providers to be able to source from safely, securely, and with the assurance that the tech works. So I do think that Australia's got a part to play. I do think we've got a country that has a heritage of great innovation. We're smart thinkers. We've been forced by our environment to think through problems, solve them, and apply technology through the course of the decades to make that happen. We have to have the faith to back Australian ideas, and we can do that. And I'm looking forward to the discussion today because I do think that this is vitally important in getting it right and doing it in a way that is not skewed on either end of the spectrum, that we're not wearing rose-colored glasses, and that we're not wringing our wrists and our hands too much, worried about the impact of technology in a way that we pull up the handbrake and prevent the benefit of information truly being as widespread as possible. So, Michael, with that, thank you for the opportunity to participate today, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you. And I think quite a summary of just the large scope of these issues. And the first, it brings us very nicely into a good question here we have from someone in the audience, which I might throw to the congressman first. But is given we've seen the rapid rise of some of these tech platforms, it's not surprising perhaps that we scramble to develop a regulatory environment to catch up. How do we guard? Where are we on this regulatory process? And how do we guard protecting legitimate concerns with not dampening the huge benefits that we get from technology?
So, it's obviously a critical judgment that government and policymakers have to make about trying to, find that right balance. But, a buddy of mine who sits on the Financial Services Committee was describing to me the other day that they had a hours and hours long hearing about cryptocurrency and, digital banking, and the speed with which that whole sort of platform of financial instruments and trying to determine ways to keep it transparent and credible and avoid people getting hurt by it is something that the Federal Reserve Board and all of the bank regulators are scrambling to catch up. I mean, it's just this thing it's moving so fast, and that's just one sector that we're talking about in terms of just the speed of which change is happening. And so having allies like Australia, who is grappling with the same issues, I think is really beneficial in terms of trying to come up with best practices and good ideas. Because I think one of the obviously the strong pillars of our alliance is the fact that we are free market economies. We believe in not having the government intrude too deeply in terms of areas of freedom of speech and protecting democracies. But there's just no question that there's bad actors out there in a lot of these areas, and we've got to really, not be too afraid of stifling innovation, in my opinion, because as I said, maybe I'm just a little too close to today's, testimony, but we're also have some of these institutions were never designed to sort of deal with this, and the fragility, I think, is pretty apparent. So again, I look forward to the work that Ed's doing with his colleagues, and certainly looking forward to comparing notes, because I think both countries can really benefit from each other's basic values and approach to governance, and really hopefully come up with good solutions.
Ed, do you think that if we were to look at the development of this regulatory environment as a kind of from a very early stage to a mature stage, where do you think Australia is on that journey? Do you think we are nearing a mature stage of regulatory environment, or do you think we're still very early on?
I think we're playing catch up, as all governments are. I recognise the challenge. Joe just mentioned there in respect of cryptocurrency. We've had the same sort of challenges ourselves. Our financial regulators are trying to scramble on that and work out how to manage a regulatory framework that doesn't stifle innovation, but at the same time protects people and allows them to be able to access that technology in a way that benefits them. Some of them have had very outdated views about the role of cryptocurrency and probably figured that it was something for the realm of people, bad actors, as opposed to an emerging way to encourage commerce. And so we've seen in our regional neighbourhood a number of countries embrace cryptocurrencies and digital currencies and race ahead on that. That poses a challenge that we get set. What we'll have is a sort of imbalance where some countries will be well advanced and be very reluctant necessarily to engage in international discussion around how we frame these things, given that they are cross-border currencies in many respects. And the other and then emerging countries seeing, getting frustrated about that, or emerging consensus being frustrated in some countries where they're starting to see this take hold and not having the regulatory frameworks in place, but not getting the cooperation on the international stage. So there is that challenge. And I think for the problem for regulators is not, it's not, I don't blame them in any respect. It's because a lot of this stuff happens at a fast pace, their own individual knowledge base is challenged, and getting the people inside their organizations to do that is really hard, because people with talent are gravitating towards the private sector, and not necessarily attracted to being involved in the front line of regulation development. So that's a challenge for regulators. And I think the fact that you've got two elected representatives here that are reflecting on what the respective jurisdictions are doing in terms of this thinking. Joe talking about the media bargaining code here in Australia. I note that David Cicilline, who Joe's referred to, has really been focused on whether or not the platforms themselves need to go through a fairly seismic shake-up, and the use of antitrust reform in that regard. And I've noted for quite some time, well before the presidential election for that matter, he's played a pivotal role in championing that himself. So I think you've got people thinking about this, and the key will be international cooperation to ensure that governments and their regulators, one, know the technology they're dealing with, two, can come up with regulatory frameworks that mitigate against the worst impacts of tech, and three, that do so in a way that allow the broader public to get that benefit. But it is a challenge because, again, bad actors are on the sidelines wanting to take advantage of every loophole and every vulnerability that exists for their own either financial or, I might say, state-based objective.
Well, that's a really good introduction to the other question, which I have from someone here today, saying nationalism from the Chinese Communist Party and its attempts to promote standards international. How can democracies work together to ensure technology works in the favor of free and open societies? Does there need to be a greater effort for a global multilateral body to promote standards? Is that the next move in this space? I might throw to
I'm going to jump in because, again, votes are fast approaching, and then I'll let Ed clean up. So, one thing I would say, President Biden, in his first State of the Union address, he actually came up to Connecticut and addressed a graduating class, Coast Guard Academy, which is a military institution in my district. And he has repeatedly said over and over again that the contest in the world today is between autocracy and democracy. And, it really boils down to that. I mean, I really think he's totally on target in terms of, the way he sees the challenge out there. And, unlike his predecessor, I think, he's not going to approach this as an America first challenge, that it really is by, through, and with allies and collaboration. And I think, as you've seen, he's had cabinet officials and folks crisscrossing, particularly Indo-Pacific region, which is, I think, happening right now with Secretary Austin and the Deputy Secretary Wendy Sherman, because I think, aside from the fact that there was a general feeling that there had to be some sort of fence mending and, reestablishing friendships, there frankly, we also then we can't sort of just walk down memory lane here. We've got some real work to do. And I think, that's going to be the policy that Tony Blinken and the Secretary of State is going to be pursuing. When the Australian Trade Minister, Ed Tahan, was in town last week, again, he had some great conversations with the U.S. Trade Representative, Catherine Tai, about trying to get a digital trade agreement that does not require a vote of Congress. It can actually be done by the executive branch with the existing Australian-U.S. free trade agreement. I think there's going to be a lot of support for that. It's kind of a baby step. It's a very incremental step in terms of trying to, I think, make improvements in the digital space that would, again, not just benefit the US and Australia, but also other neighboring countries in the region. And it's not TPP, but it's at least, a sign of intelligent life, that we want to really get serious about engaging, with our allies like Australia and in the digital space, which again, it's a very sort of mechanical, logistical kind of agreement that we're talking about here. It's not dealing with the big issues of misinformation and bad actors who are trying to interfere with elections. But I think it shows where I think this administration wants to go, and there will be bipartisan support for that type of effort, and I think it'll be something that hopefully, people like myself and Ed and your panel today will participate in, because as the president said, this really is not just sort of about economic growth, which is a wonderful thing, and promoting, economic development. It really is about, in my opinion, the future of democracy.
And Ed, do you want to comment on that as well, given it's almost closer to home for Australia?
Absolutely. And Joe's remarks about the impact on democracy, absolutely fundamentally important. I do think we need to have balance in the view about the impact of technology. Yes, it can provide an important economic spur, but we are seeing some of the other elements of the application of technology that are hurting democracies, hurting the way decisions are made for the benefit of countries and communities, and having individual impacts as well. And these things are not going to be easy to sort out from just a unilateral perspective of one country going it alone. It's going to require international cooperation. And I think, Joe, if I can emphasize to you, I think on that need for international cooperation, the fact that the Biden administration has worked so hard from day one to re-engage with its friends on the international stage and to work much more collaboratively on issues of global importance, particularly in the frame that you said of autocracy or that you reflected the president's remarked on with respect to autocracy, autocratic v democratic approaches to governance. This of itself is the most important first step in being able to deal with these other issues that are the focus of today's webinar. And I think to not reflect on that in the context of this discussion would, I think, weaken this discussion. It is really important that we have that going and that we have like-minded countries able and genuinely thinking that we can work together on these issues. So I do think it is very important in that. And there are some practical ways as well that we need to work together, not just in terms of the way in which platforms operate and obviously the economic power that's generated that. Some of this technology, for example, the use of artificial intelligence, it needs a lot of data to work. The more data that you get, the better and more sophisticated your technology is, the greater the commercial benefit, the greater the economic power that's generated. You can see step by step by step the way in which this works and the ethics around the application of AI. That really, there'll be some that can be driven by the business world, but largely communities will expect governments to set up those type of frameworks as well. So be it either from an economic or a social perspective, governments will matter, and governments working together will matter.
In a moment, we'll get to our panel. Who will go into some of these questions in a little bit more detail from an industry perspective. But before we do, I might just wrap in, because I'm conscious of time, a couple questions into one, if I can, and just ask for your final comments here. Three related questions here. But one is, why is research and development so poor, particularly, Ed, you mentioned in Australia, given significant tax concessions? And are there lessons from the United States? Also, what does it take for research and development programs to be commercialized? And are there pressures to create jobs by nation? Are there more pressures to create jobs in Australia in the industry, in the United States? And finally, if we are having a discussion now about promoting research and development, is there a risk that in trying to curb some of the excesses of big tech, that we actually put up barriers to small startup tech companies that are often driving new innovation? So I know that there's a lot there to unpack, but as a final comment, can I throw to you, Congressman?
Sure. So, I would say I wouldn't describe America as necessarily, doing that much better than anyone else, like certainly than Australia. I mean, we do have a tax code which nominally has incentives for R&D, which is, something that companies like Pfizer and Moderna, certainly use to the benefit of the world, I would say. But our tax code needs to be actually, I think, a lot more precise and can use some improvements in terms of really trying to make sure that that type of activity is truly results from again, the way the code is arranged. One just sort of observation I would leave you with is just that, even in the polarized environment of the Congress right now, the U.S. Senate actually about 2 or 3 weeks ago reported out a bill called Endless Frontier Act, which is basically sort of a sprawling bill to try and deal with what I think was identified as the pacing threat of China in terms of, how we've actually sort of lagged in terms of key sectors in the economy, and really pretty impressive bipartisan agreement in terms of investing in, both the educational system and trying to, foster different sectors that really, both the pandemic and I think the competition with China has really exposed vulnerabilities. So, but that, again, is and you can go through a whole series of supply chain weaknesses, which the pandemic exposed, and Ed mentioned this at the outset, some of which are in critical national security areas like strategic and critical minerals. Some were obviously in the healthcare sector, some are in the microchip space, where again, we have the price of automobiles basically spiking up our inflation numbers just because of the fact that, we have a complete sort of breakdown, in terms of getting cars built to satisfy the demand that's out there. So, again, I think this administration, realized that the competition with China and the bill that came out of the Senate sort of reflects this as well, is more than just about things like building submarines, which, obviously is a big part of my work on the House Armed Services Committee, or, the pivot to the Pacific, in terms of, the Navy and et cetera. I mean, we really, it's a much bigger challenge, and it really has to be sort of all hands on deck in terms of economic policy, trade policy, and foreign policy, in terms of, again, some of the new efforts that we just discussed a moment ago. And hopefully these types of, events like the one that you're sponsoring today are going to help sort of, boost, that type of activity. And really thank you very much for the opportunity to join you this evening. You might have heard that buzzer in the background of my office. That means there's votes. So I do have to finally sign off here. And again, thank you, all of you and your team, for organizing this, and to Ed for the great work that he and his colleagues are doing in Canberra. So take care.
Thank you very much, Representative Courtney. And for final comments on those same questions, if I can throw to Ed, especially the ones around research and development in Australia were particularly relevant here. So I might throw to you, Ed, and understand, then we'll head to our panelists.
Terrific, thanks. I'm not challenged by bells in any short space of time, either now or into the future, given that we're pretty much going to be in lockdown for the next 4 weeks here. So I do, as I said, feel Joe's pain. and very grateful that we're able to bring him on this panel and just to get an insight about some of the thinking within the new US administration and in particular Congress around some of these issues. On R&D, and I noticed I've been going through the Q&A section, and I noticed that the question had been raised. Why is our R&D so poor, given that we've got major economic or taxation incentives that back some of this stuff in? And there was another question around the paucity of commercialization. I just note that there's been, I think, off the top of my head, 60 plus reports on the commercialization. We've had 2 that were being done by 2 separate departments in this government during the course of this parliament, one by education and the other by industry. And I think there is very little bit innovation to be gained by producing more reports. I think at its heart, there is a cultural issue and a lack of leadership issue. When governments focus attention of business, community, others on issues that are affecting us either economically or in terms of socially, I think there is a lot to be gained by governments driving that and also driving the focus of administrations to see outcomes. And I think there are big cultural issues in one, I think that we don't back the quality of our own ideas, and we don't have within industry a willingness to back that. We have smaller businesses that use that R&D tax incentive, for example, and value it enormously to ensure their growth into bigger firms. So it's not that it doesn't have an impact for smaller ones, or in line with some elements of the questions that, Michael, you got asked to put to me, that we throttle the ability of smaller firms to get that support. It is vital to them. But bigger firms making decisions about whether or not to onshore the development and application of technology, this is a real issue. And governments not backing that in is a big issue too. And while I've sort of tried to rein in some of the more partisan elements of it, I think like hearing in the space of the last 12 months our Prime Minister say that we need to get better at adopting technology from elsewhere, I've said in other parts that our ambition should not be the best customer of an app store. We should be driving the application of technology, the creation of solutions using technology to sort out problems is something that Australians have done for generations. And we do have that capability to do it. We need governments to make this a priority, to say that they want to drive this. If they need to reform R&D to make that a reality, so be it. But we cannot have a situation where we continue to slide down the global innovation index, where our R&D as a proportion of GDP continues to contract, and then think in an environment where, for example, our neighbours, if you look at what the Singaporeans are doing, they've set aside nearly 20 billion Australian dollars over the next 3 years to help businesses innovate and build capability and take them through the next phase of transformation as a result of the coming out of the pandemic or having to deal with it. And that they've set up emerging technology platforms where governments are willingly co-funding the cost of trials and adoption of emerging technology from 5G, AI, etc., cybersecurity. We do need to actively partner in that way. We have I think a 1.5 billion manufacturing initiative in this country. When you compare what the Singaporeans are doing on AI or on what they're trying to do with capability within their economy and contrast it in the Australian context, I just think we've got to get a lot more serious about it. So leadership will play a part, resourcing will play a part, reform will play a part, but having a sense of urgency about this to bind it all together is really critical.
Thank you so much, Honourable Ed Husic, for joining us. It's been fantastic to have you. And I'm also very excited to be throwing to Dr. Michael Mandel from the Progressive Policy Institute, who will be taking over through the panel, where we're going to hear from some of senior experts in both Australia and the United States to break down a little bit of what was said today and also what wasn't said today. So over to you, Michael Mandel.
Thank you very much, Michael. We have a lot of Michaels on on the panel and hosting today. I'm the Chief Economic Strategist at the Progressive Policy Institute. Very glad to be working with the McKell Institute. Before the pandemic, I made several visits to Australia to discuss issues like privacy and the Australian app economy. As an economist by training, I actually spend a lot of my time thinking about how global networks interact with national economies, including taxes, cross-border trade, all sorts of issues. And global networks clearly have the potential to accelerate growth if we figure out how to diffuse technological knowledge. But this panel is less about the global economics of networks and more about the interaction between global networks and democratic decision-making. The congressman had a great pithy statement. He said some of these institutions never were designed to deal with this. And Husic said governments matter. And so one of the questions that I wanted to put to the panel is how can we use technology to innovate political and mass decision-making in a positive sense? How can we use technology to build new institutions to bring people together rather than apart? If we look out 10 years, are we in a transition stage? And if so, a transition stage to what? What kind of new institutions can we have for international cooperation? We're thinking a lot about the role of government, but in some sense, technology affects how government works as well. And so, it's almost very self-referential. And going to turn over these questions and others to a great panel. Let me introduce them. We've got Sunita Bose, who is Managing Director of Digi, the not-for-profit industry association that advocates for the digital industry in Australia. We've got Mike Massnick, who is the founder and editor of the Tech Dirt blog, which I read regularly, as well as the founder of the Silicon Valley think tank, the Courtney Institute. And we've got Damian Kassabgi, who is the EVP of Corporate Affairs at Afterpay. And really, I guess the first question that I want to put to you, Sunita, is, are we in a transition stage? And if so, a transition stage to what?
Thank you so much for the question, and thank you to the McKell Institute for hosting this conversation. I also just want to underline that this is such an important conversation to have with a US and Australian audience. Certainly the comparisons between the US and Australia are always awake to me, in my mind personally, as I approach my work, because I lived in San Francisco for 5 years. And so I often hold the promise of how people think about technology in the US and want to see that same ambition really cultivated in Australia. Look, I think there's a lot to that question. In terms of are we at a transition moment, it's interesting right now, it's 2021, we're in a moment post-pandemic where we've seen the capacity of technology to be a real bridge for people across a wide range of industries in terms of enabling commerce and connection in an unprecedented, challenging time. And I think, the Honourable Ed Husic talked a lot about how how technology can actually foster the broader economy. And so, in Australia, we've seen research where, the technology sector itself has a huge economic impact, but it's digitizing capability across the economy that we really need to harness. And so in Australia, we have a strategy towards 2030 where our government wants to be a leading digital economy by 2030. And we need a roadmap now to get us there. And I think, going back to why looking at ourselves compared to sort of other markets such as the US is really important, it's because actually Australia is not starting that race in the lead towards 2030. And I think that's something that we need to be really mindful of as we approach some of these tough questions, is that, we actually have the second smallest technology sector in the OECD. The Honourable Ed Husic talked about adoption, and it's a really important point. We're actually extremely good, as he said, at adoption. I think out of the OECD, we're second best in terms of adoption in the workplace. And, I would argue that our ambition as we try to be a leading digital economy, as we look to countries like the US to grow our technology sector, we need to look at the areas where we lag. And some of those areas are things like the size of the sector, technology service exports. How can we be building amazing technology here in Australia? I think at the same time, we can do that, and we can also really actively manage the new challenges that take on new dimensions, many of which that we've talked about today, and such as disinformation, misinformation. You know, we also didn't talk about online safety that much, or hate speech or defamation. There's lots of different challenges, and I'm firmly of the view that we can do both. We can be really ambitious about our strategy and how we become a leading digitally enabled economy by 2030, but we can also be really creative, cooperative across markets in terms of how we step up to these new challenges.
Thank you very much. Mike, another Mike. Okay, are we in a transition? And if so, a transition to what?
I mean, it's a good and very broad question, and I don't know that.
Well, that's why I'm asking it.
I don't know if I have a very good and broad answer. I think yes, obviously, I think we're clearly in a transition state, and you know, part of the nature of the internet and technology and innovation is that it is constantly changing, and we seem to go through sort of, you know, broad, you know, eras of where the technology is and kind of what is important about it. And I think we're in a state now where people are very seriously reconsidering, you know, where the state of technology is today and where it should be. And because of that, it is inevitably changing. And so there is definitely a transition period. The question then is where's that going? If I had the crystal ball, I'd probably be out there investing rather than sitting on a panel talking about it. But what I will say is I think, you know, one of the things that people are really coming to terms with over the last few years in looking at how the industry has developed is that this is not the internet that we expected. If we go back 20 years, 30 years, even 10 years ago, and you look at kind of what people thought the internet was going to be like, it wasn't quite this. It wasn't an internet that really, you know, had a few very large companies that were, you know, running everything. And I think that there is a legitimate concern that people have had about that. And so I think that people are recognizing that there is an opportunity to say, the thing that got everybody excited about the internet, whenever it was that we all got the internet, were a whole bunch of things that we're not seeing quite as much of today. It is there, and oftentimes it's kind of buried, but it is there. And so I think there's this growing recognition that it's time to see, how do we take the internet that we have today and bring it more towards the vision of what we all wanted it to be, you know, 10, 20 years ago when we all sort of first started to get on the internet. And so I think that this is the opportunity to move towards an internet that has those benefits of you know, communicating around the world. The fact that we're all sitting here around the globe having this panel broadcast to anyone anywhere, you know, around the globe as well over the internet is amazing and wonderful and powerful. But there are a whole bunch of concerns that we've discovered over the last few years about the way that the technology can be abused, or that it can be controlled in ways that maybe are not great for society or for democracy. And so we're trying to understand all of those things without throwing out the benefits of it. So there's an opportunity. And then with that, of course, with any opportunity, there's always risk. And so my concern is always that in seeing sort of the problems that have developed these days around things like misinformation, disinformation, that the response is sort of too often a very quick knee-jerk response, and the focus is on pointing fingers and figuring out who to blame, rather than figuring out, how do we get to the root problems of this? How do we solve the actual issues? And how do we actually take this to somewhere productive? And so, you know, to me, I hope that we're in a transition to an internet that we were promised, and I fear that we're in a transition to a much more problematic and locked down internet as people maybe overreact to some of the bad stuff that we've seen over the last few years.
Thank you. Thank you. Damian, do you want to address the transition issue from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks very much, and appreciate McKell putting this on. It's great to hear Ed Husic speak about these matters. If I can just kind of add to what Mike was talking about in relation to what the internet has turned into and where it's going looking into the future, I think, you know, the question for us, is it a good idea that a company as big as Facebook purchases Instagram and then purchases WhatsApp, and then for government to have to think about unwinding that or looking at it from a reverse perspective. Biden just 2 weeks ago made some announcements around competition and specifically spoke about the tech sector, and Congressman Joe Courtney also mentioned these market power issues. But it seems to be the case that government is looking at this in after the fact, that market power is being looked at after there is such a degree of dominance that is potentially hard to unwind. And Biden did say something interesting, and he said that instead of finding their own consumers, some of these companies are consuming their competitors, which is effectively a practice that we've seen, which we know stifles competition in competitive markets. If we're to throw forward, just to think about, okay, what Mike just spoke about in relation to the internet and who controls the internet, I feel we're in the early stages of that when it comes to digital and cryptocurrencies. And I think the lessons in relation to what's happened from broad platform perspectives should be taken now as we consider the growth of digital cryptocurrencies, which we know are going to be very, very big. We have reserve banks around the world considering what a digital currency looks like, especially one that's backed by a currency and is more stable, or a stable coin, rather than something that fluctuates like a Bitcoin. And if we're looking into the payment landscape in Australia, for example, just to give an example, right now, because of COVID, we've seen a huge uptake of digital wallets, which is interesting and important and is a great technology, something I use. But at the end of 2020, around 35% of all payments on a debit or MasterCard, debit or credit card was made through a digital wallet. By the end of this year, the Commonwealth Bank predicts that 50% of all payments of a debit or credit card will be made through a digital wallet, mostly controlled by Apple. If we're to throw forward and look at the experience in China, that number gets to 70, 80% of all payments in the economy very, very quickly from an in-store perspective. Now, if you think about a democracy, who controls a currency, who controls payments, who is the gateway, I think it won't take long for the same questions that's been asked about what do we do about massive tech controlling social media and the conversation, to who is controlling the currency in a few years.
So let me actually, Damian, let me actually follow up that, because it's really interesting. You mentioned China, okay? And of course, the Chinese payment system is government controlled. And what we're seeing at this point in some ways is when you sort of look at the size of the big tech companies, part of the question is, do you compare them to government, to Chinese enterprises as well? Do you compare them to the global economy? And that gets into political questions and institutional questions. And part of this is what we're sort of talking about, okay? And so from your perspective, I mean, how do you think about the Chinese payment system, the Indian payment systems, okay, in terms of what you're worried about?
Well, it's not what we're worried about. I think it's, I think if anything, it's one of those situations where developing countries have leapfrogged the developed world in relation to taking on digital currencies and payment systems. And there's more of a lesson there in relation to what's coming. And what's coming is that it's not going to be the case that a local bank is controlling your money. If you've got something that has some blockchain technology behind it, that can be honest about where your money is and how it's being transferred, and that can be done in a very transparent way. And if there's a digital currency that's backed by a local currency from a pricing perspective, then that becomes a very attractive offering. I think the the people that are most threatening that kind of system are the Visa and MasterCard rails. But then who is controlling that, and how does government ensure there's adequate competition in the marketplace for digital currencies, and ensuring that their own reserve bank has some kind of control over those currencies? So I see it as less of a threat, more of the fact that they have leapfrogged us. I believe that, Western countries can look at that and learn from it. And, the Chinese experience is that, very quickly, 80% of the transactions there in their economy were through a digital wallet. And that is coming very quickly in the context of Western democracies.
How would you, let me just, one more question here, because this is, how would you sort of feel about using Chinese payment systems in Australia?
Look, it's not a question for me. I think what's important here is that platforms are regulated in a way that's appropriate. We need to be thinking about platforms that are ubiquitous, more in the way that they are essential infrastructure in the economy, even if they were created by the private sector rather than pure businesses. And what I mean by that, the way that we have thought about airports or rail lines, or rather essential infrastructure that needs to be shared, that needs to have some kind of fair and level playing field, is also applied to some of these platforms that blockchain technology will support to ensure there is some equity and regulation in the space. What I mean by that is that the people that control the infrastructure may also be competing, and we've thought about the vertical integration of competition in a number of markets, and we need to think about it from a digital perspective as well. And there is talk of the super app. What happens when Apple owns the platform as well as controls a lot of the apps, or for example, the digital wallet, as well as controlling the platform? How does that potentially stifle competition? And it's a discussion now in the digital wallets inquiry, the parliamentary inquiry happening in Australia. So I do think government is important here, especially if it recognizes that whether it's a digital wallet, whether it's a blockchain technology with a currency, whether it's something like the App Store, are more things that are becoming like what I would call essential infrastructure than simply businesses in the economy.
Mike, do you want to sort of add on to this question, or your thoughts along this way?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really interesting. I think that there is a lot, there are a lot of really good points that Damian made that are worth thinking about. But I also think that this whole space that is coming out of the sort of blockchain cryptocurrency space is interesting in different ways, and that there's a real risk that if I understand the desire to sort of have regulatory guardrails on it and how it works. And obviously we've seen cases of sort of scams or sketchy uses of cryptocurrency, especially over the last few years. But we're also seeing some really interesting layers of innovation that aren't necessarily, controlled, and aren't necessarily controlled by large institutions, whether those are sort of governmental institutions or corporations. And so I think there's something really interesting to be learned from the cryptocurrency space, and to sort of pay attention closely to it in the ways in which it's being used to sort of route around the giant companies that are controlling things. So the discussion that we started with earlier about the power and dominance of a Facebook or a Google or whoever else, that suddenly there is a possible, it's still very early, but there is a possible vision where you could build alternative platforms or alternative services that aren't necessarily controlled by these particular companies, and it gives an alternative route to allow for innovation and for some really creative solutions, often by leveraging what it is that the cryptocurrency setup and things like smart contracts allows. There's this feeling among some that to some extent, who are the largest and dominant companies today is a kind of static thing, that there are companies that are so large today that they'll never be taken down. And yet I think, you can see the seeds of what might undermine Facebook's future in some of what is happening in the crypto space today. I don't think it's easy. I don't think it's obvious. I don't think it's definite that some of what is happening in crypto space takes down Facebook. But I think that we're seeing really different approaches and really innovative approaches. And so the thing that I worry about somewhat in the call for greater and greater regulation of that space is that in doing that, and in focusing just on the sort of payments aspect of the cryptocurrency and blockchain stuff, you may end up stifling the ability of the sort of new and more innovative solutions to come about.
Sunita?
I guess I'll just take a big step back and sort of think more about kind of regulation in general in terms of, I actually started my career at a smaller my technology career, actually. I had a whole other career in advocacy before that, but my technology career started at change.org and I headed up global policy for them. And one of the big projects that I took on board there was implementing the GDPR. And I can say that for a smaller company, that exercise was really, really challenging. And so I'm always awake to that experience when we think about these questions of competition and regulation, because we need to make sure that the regulation is designed in a way that a broad range of companies can implement it. And then, you know, to bring this conversation back to Australia, Australia is a country where there are few global native digital firms. And I think as we think to 2030 and to become Australia becoming a leading digitally enabled economy, these are the sorts of problems that we need to solve. And I think, you know, we need to have a holistic picture of these issues of competition in terms of how we don't stifle innovation in the approach. And I think, you know, just to make a very general comment about the broad range of issues that I think we've touched upon today, to me, the solution to a lot of these challenges is just around really close collaboration between governments, between companies of a range of different sizes, so that what we're designing as we try to keep regulation and policy approaches, you know, make sure that they keep pace with the challenges that we're experiencing now, that we've got something that's really deeply rooted in the experience of practitioners.
Okay, so we sort of veered into into regulation at this point, and one of the things that PPI has looked at is sort of regulatory improvement, how one does regulation in a better way. And this is important for tonight's panel, because if we're talking about democracy, we're talking about the effects of technology on democracy. We're also talking about, can we improve the way that regulation is done? Can we actually have better institutions to sort of find better consensus, okay, in a way that works both economically and also for individuals? Sunita, do you want to sort of briefly address that?
Yeah, I'll just say that, look, a big focus of the organization that I run, Digi, is around how we closely collaborate with government around some of these, you know, really hard challenges. So an example is that, you know, the government wanted to tackle disinformation and misinformation in Australia, which we've talked a lot about today. And so Digi led on the development of a code of practice around disinformation and misinformation that, you know, 8 companies have signed up to, that really commits them to annual transparency reports around the approach, around safeguards that many of them already had in place, but this is sort of a way for them to create ongoing transparency with the Australian public and more broadly. These transparency reports are already available on our website around what they're doing on misinformation and disinformation. And so I raised this because I think it's important for people to know that this exists in the context of the challenge that we've been talking a lot about today in terms of disinformation and misinformation. But this was an industry-led code. And, you know, it was really grounded in the experience of practitioners, as I said. And it's got, you know, and it's grounded by researchers. We collaborated with the University of Technology to make sure that we're factoring in a broad view of these challenges. I think Mike Masnick, you know, raised earlier that, okay, there's often like a swing, like we have a knee-jerk response, and then there can be an unintended consequence. And I think, you know, making sure that we're thinking those things through as we come up with these solutions to really hard problems is really important. And I also think there's a temptation sometimes with these really difficult problems when they manifest online to look solely with tunnel vision just at the online dimension. But I think what we really need to make sure we do is that we have a broader approach, so that, you know, yes, we've got, you know, what I obviously I'm biased, but what I think is a strong code of practice on disinformation and misinformation in relation to this issue, where, you know, 8 major technology companies have signed on, but 8 technology companies doesn't make the internet. And I think, you know, as mainstream companies get better and better at this and improve and collaborate to make sure that their approach is better, we will see challenges like mis and disinformation spill over onto other platforms. I think we started to see that here in Australia over the weekend with the lockdown protests, much of which happened on Telegram. So then how are we addressing those underlying issues that are causing people to take to the streets and create public health challenges? That's something that we need to look closely at. And then governments have a critical role to play, not only in encouraging industry action here, but also in terms of intelligence and understanding the bad actors that are behind things like disinformation. So we really need to make sure that we keep that broad view, and that really relies on a multi-stakeholder approach.
I mean, part of what you're saying is that there's the tech platforms, and then there's issues that are going on that are separate from the tech platforms, and we need to sort of have a broad view about what we're trying to sort of deal with. Mike, do you want to sort of address that?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really important point, and I think it's one that I've tried to raise in a number of different forums, is that a lot of the issues that we're looking at are, to some extent, these are societal level problems, and many of them are really examples of societal level problems that governments themselves have failed to solve, going back forever. There are issues around education, there are issues around mental health, there are issues around sort of civil and criminal justice and how all of that works. And there are a whole bunch of issues around just the nature of free expression. If we believe in free expression, that leads to some expression that we might not agree with. And how do you deal with all of these things? And really what seems to have happened is that, what we're seeing a lot of is that the use of technology and social media in particular to where these issues are coming up, that is surfacing these things. It's shining a light on these larger problems. And rather than looking at them and saying, how do we deal with the root causes of these, the real reasons why we're having these sort of societal level problems, the focus seems to be on, well, let's just blame the technology companies for exposing that. That's not to say that the technology companies can't do things better. They can't be more, because they should be more transparent. They should come up with better, practices. They should come up with ways to deal with what they can. But the focus seems to be on just sort of blaming them for shining a light on these problems that that governments and society going back forever have failed to solve, and saying, well, you solve it. But there's a problem there when we're saying that these companies that we're already, lots of people are saying, are concerned about how powerful they are, then we're saying now they have to solve these societal level problems that have never been solved otherwise. I don't think that works. I don't think that's an effective way of going about it. So I think to do this right, to actually deal with societal level problems, it has to involve taking a step back, looking at them. What are the real root causes of this? What are the possible solutions? And what are the trade-offs associated with those solutions? Rather than sort of jumping in and saying, well, we're seeing disinformation on Facebook, therefore it's Facebook's problem. We must blame Facebook for that, because that doesn't solve the underlying thing. If anything, it's just sort of an attempt to sweep it under the rug. And as Sunita just pointed out, then it just moves somewhere else. So you're not solving any of the underlying issues. And so I think it's really, really important that if we're going to see real progress made on these things, we have to recognize that they're all connected. You can't just narrowly target it and say, because I see bad stuff on Facebook, it's a problem that can be solved by Facebook. I think we have to take a much more holistic societal level look at these things and recognize that these are real challenges, but you're not going to, ask Mark Zuckerberg to solve it and see anything that is remotely useful.
I think that's a really important point there, because when I look at a lot of these issues, and not just the economic issues, but also the social issues, you're absolutely right. These are issues that have been around that are just very, very difficult to solve. Okay. And we grapple with questions like globalization and the effects of globalization on people. We grapple with the effects of inequality on people, and they're broader social issues than that are not going to be solved by regulating the tech platforms. I've gotten a question here that's a little bit off on a different track about Chinese firms and the flows of technology between the West and between China. Okay, which direction do you see technology to which directions do you see technology flowing between the West and between China? Okay, and how important is movements of technology, both overt and covert, from the Western economies to the Chinese economy, and how much is going the other direction as well? Okay, Damian, do you want to sort of take a shot at that?
Yeah, hard question. And I think this is a kind of dynamic issue that everyone is grappling with. You know, China has very much made it very difficult for US companies, especially in the media space, to enter that market. And most companies, and having worked at Google for 3 years, at that time was very difficult to get the core Google services into China, because this kind of technology was seen to be in China's national interest to control, because of the kind of information that it was getting. I think there was a sense 10 years ago that there's no way China could build replicas, that there's no way that China could actually build something that is as good as or similar to what Silicon Valley was creating, that these products are too hard to copy. I think that's been disproven. And that these companies are now big, they're well used. Yes, they are copycats, but they are also successful. The other way to look at it is that TikTok is a recent innovation that has come from Asia into the West and come in a big way. And many have welcomed that in relation to the competition in the space, considering that, you know, in the West, video type platforms have been controlled by effectively one or two companies in Facebook and Google, that this actually may be a welcome thing, that there is some significant competition in the marketplace. I think it will be interesting to see whether innovation and democracy are linked in the long term. At the end of the day, is the invention of some of these major technologies, a lot of the thinking around digital currencies, the fact that Afterpay was created in Australia, that Google, Facebook, etc. was created in the US. Is this linked to a society that is democratic, open for innovation or not? I think that's an open question. Like, I would hope that at the end of the day, that free and open societies allow for new innovation, and that wins. And I think that's what everyone is hoping for, but it's yet to be seen. Going back to your earlier question, Mike, in relation to regulation, I don't think, and I think this is an interesting point, having worked in the US for a number of years, about the way that we should think about regulation is not necessarily rules-based or things that stifle or block or stop. I think there is, you know, an idea out there that regulation or government intervention is simply, you know, the speed limit. It stops you from doing something. Whereas going to some of the comments that were made earlier, I do think that regulation can help in creating open societies and open business, especially on platform technologies. I think it is a good idea to have as many companies as possible innovate and create new things. I think part of the problem is that the larger companies tend to either purchase it or copy it very quickly and then control it. I think that is something that is significant that we need to consider, and where government steps in relation to ensuring that competition can flourish. The other thing is Australia's position in the world here, I think is important, and I think it is potentially not leveraged enough. One, a country that has a decent relationship with the US and historically has had a decent relationship with China, and certainly continues to have a lot of trade with China. We are a significant player in the tech business. And to give you a sense of that, when you take the biggest markets in the world, US, UK, Germany, Japan, a lot of the time US tech companies can't enter China. Australia is somewhere between the 5th and 7th largest market. So what Australia says and does is important. And it was kind of pleasing to hear Congressman Joe Courtney comment on this, especially around the media code. Like, even though that may have been a strange place to start in relation to tech reform, it is an interesting insight that Australia does matter. we do matter to the major tech companies because we are around the 5th biggest market for most of them. And we are heard in the US when Australian lawmakers decide that there's an important issue that needs intervention.
So, but let's just actually sort of pull up together some of these pieces. I mean, you make a point about China keeping out US tech companies, okay? And so part of the question here is that if you have an authoritarian player, okay, and then you sort of have democratic players, and the regulatory structure is, regulators are trying to sort of put not the sort of to sort of put, I'm not sure what the right word is, are sort of focused on the domestic players, okay, on the Western players rather than on the international players. What sort of consequences does that have? Mike?
I mean, I think it's a good point. I think it goes both ways for Australia. Australia does focus on domestic players. I think that's part of the problem. I think it's only been of recent that Australia's woken up to the fact that actually there is local industry that is interacting with global companies. And that's why the media code was a kind of important step in the direction of saying that there is important competition here happening in the marketplace. You know, at the end of the day, just to give you an example, Afterpay is Australia's first consumer-facing tech product to enter the US and succeed. The first. You know, Australia is used to receiving Uber, Google, Twitter, etc., into Australia. It is the first time a consumer-facing tech product has entered the US and succeeded. But we can only succeed if there is a fair platform to play on through the Apple Wallet, especially as we go in store. So that just gives you an example as to the kind of market power that Apple has. You cannot use the NFC chip to make a purchase without going through the Apple Wallet. That is not free. That is something that Apple has decided to control through its wallet. It means that Apple takes a take on every time a transaction is made. These are kind of important power dynamics that Australia needs to think about as it kind of not only regulates its own industry, but understands how these powerful players are entering the Australian market.
Mike?
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of different things that you could comment on here. I mean, you know, obviously having competition is important, but open competition is really what often leads to innovation. I mean, I think it has been really interesting to see what's happened in, you know, with companies coming out of China, and you know, frankly they're not all copycats. You know, in the early days maybe they were, but you know, what WeChat has done has been incredibly innovative, and now you have, you know, both Apple and Facebook in many ways sort of trying to copy what WeChat has done, and the sort of market hold that it's taken, and obviously TikTok is very innovative in that it's done very different things. The real question, sort of longer term, is that these are dynamic markets. These are things that are constantly changing, and how do you stay innovative in a market that is so dynamic and is changing so rapidly? And I do wonder whether or not China and the Chinese firms will be able to keep up, because they don't have that more open system. They don't have the competition domestically that sort of drives them to innovate. You know, they sort of have a leg up, and we've now seen to some extent. There was just a report, I think, either last week or this week, that you know, the Chinese government may be moving on from the consumer internet, and they've sort of been pushing back on the consumer internet companies and really doubling down on things like artificial intelligence and Huawei and actual, you know, hardware infrastructure. And so, you know, I do think that in more open markets where there is real competition, where competition is enabled, is where we see longer term innovation and more dynamic innovation, because it's not a one-stop shop. It's how these things continue to evolve over time. And so I still think that, you know, the markets that are open, that allow for more competition and innovation, are going to succeed long term.
So let's wrap up. Sunita, do you want to sort of say one last minute word?
Last word, well, look, I'll just take it bigger picture again, and just pick up on something that Damian said. You know, he talked about can we have innovation? Can we have democracy? And what is the role of regulation? And I think to summarize all of this, I think that's key. And like, as a technology optimist, I think we can have innovation. I think we can have thriving democracies. My view of that is because, as I mentioned, I started my technology career at change.org, which shows you the true promise when you put the ability of the plurality of voices that we can have in our democracy when you elevate them. But we need regulation, and the regulation needs to be right. How we get that regulation right is about deep cooperation, and we can have all of these things, thrive. But that is the key, and I think that is the key challenge that we have at this, key transition moment, as you said, Michael, and as we navigate all of these challenges over the next decade.
So let me just say one closing word here. I think that we sort of have this a transition where we have the large tech firms that have been investing a lot of money, okay, and providing services, and we have to sort of have a balancing act between making sure that they're sort of open as well, and that with the regulation we sort of run the risk of sort of having unforeseen consequences that we perhaps are not expecting in terms of hobbling growth in the developed countries. So let me actually sort of bring this to a close right now and thank the panelists and thank the McKell Institute. Mike, do you want to say a last word?
I might just make a final comment, but to say thank you, Michael and Alec and everyone at PPI for helping make this happen, as well as all of our panelists and guests. It's been fantastic. One of the reasons why McKell is looking to do more work in this space, I think, is over the last year, it's been very clear that you cannot separate digital innovation or tech from economic growth, and from all companies now having a moment of this. You look at this during the pandemic with most shops turning to delivery, online methods, online payments, and so on. And that change has just begun, but it's here to stay. And so that puts an element of tech into every aspect of policy. And so we need to get better at understanding it from a policymaker point of view. And so this is where some discussions like this have a huge impact on us. And I really thank everyone for here. So thank you very much for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day or evening if you're in the United States.
Thank you.